So welcome everybody. So happy to see the room full and so glad that everybody came out. We wanted to make a good showing for Noah and y'all came out and we really appreciate that. So I'm Jane Patterson. I'm the president of the Baton Rouge Audubon Society and we're hosting tonight's event. And we're very excited to have our speaker here. I do want to thank LSU and Dr. Crystal Johnson particularly for allowing us to use this beautiful venue. It's very nice to use a wonderful facility like this, so we appreciate that very much, Crystal. So I'm going to do an abbreviated bio of Noah because if I started listing all of his accomplishments and credentials, I would be speaking longer than he is tonight. So Noah Strycker is a writer, photographer, and self-described birdman based near Eugene, Oregon. And in 2015, during a quest spanning 41 countries and all 7 continents, he set a world record by finding 6,042 species of birds, more than half the birds on Earth in one calendar year. Noah has written several books, is associated editor of Birding Magazine, and guides in the polar regions for Quark expeditions and Antarctic logistics and expeditions. He's worked on field research projects in Antarctica, the Arctic, as well as Central and South America, Australia, and various places in the United States. Noah was named the American Birding Association's Young Birder of the Year in 2004. He's also a competitive tennis player and captained the Oregon State team at #1 singles. In the summer of 2011, Noah hiked the entire 2,665-mile Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada, averaging about 22 miles a day for 4 months. So I could go on, and we're very excited to have Noah here tonight. But before I let him speak, I want to tell a little bit about how this came about, that we asked Noah to come. So this time last year, mid-April, I was looking at eBird, which is a logging tool that we use to make records of what birds are being seen. And I was looking at eBird to try to decide where I wanted to go birding. So I was looking at Cameron pairs, I was looking at Grand Isle to try to decide where I was going to go. And as I'm perusing the list in eBird, I see Noah Strycker's name. I said, wait, on Grand Isle. He had just birded on Grand Isle. I said, wait, the Noah Strycker? So I clicked on his name, and yes, it was the Noah Strycker. So I clicked on his list, and in the comment it said that he had been birding with the Terrebonne Bird Club. So we have members of the Terrebonne Bird Club here tonight. We have Paul and Carol Schaub who came up for this event. We appreciate that, because they're really part of the reason that this all happened. So they had, and I looked on their Facebook page to see if they had listed an event with Noah, and they certainly had listed an event on Grand Isle, but it didn't mention anything about Noah. And they did a post-trip report to say that they had a very good day, great birds, et cetera, and no mention of Noah. And so I commented on their Facebook post and said, looks like y'all had a great day and you're birding with celebrities. And Carol said, what do you mean? And I said, Noah Strycker was with you. Noah is the 2015 Global Big Year winner. He's this and he's that. He's a celebrity birder. And she said, well, he had just introduced himself as Noah from Oregon. And we just thought he was a nice young man who knew his birds, and we invited him to come along. So he got to spend the day with the Terrebonne Bird Club. And so I told my friend Colette about that. And Colette Dean is one of our program committee chair people. And she heard about that and she said, oh, we are going to have to ask Noah to come back. We're going to have to show him a good time and tell him about Louisiana birds, Louisiana birding, and ornithology. So I'm going to invite him back. So she reached out to Noah and asked him to come back, and he agreed to do so. And thank you to Colette for her diligence in getting him here. And writing wonderful articles, which is part of the reason that we have so many people in the room. So appreciate the effort very much. So, all right, without further ado, I will turn it over to Noah.
Testing. Testing? Hey, that sounds pretty good to me. All right. Well, Paul and Carol, it's great to see you again. Yeah, it's good to be back in Louisiana. Are you getting a weird echo on this one? Maybe I'll switch back to the lavalier. Have a moment to check out this sword-billed hummingbird here from Colombia while I switch over. Can you hear me now? Hey, there we go. Maybe I'll go over to this side. Sound good? So, yeah, Grand Isle last year, we had some good birds down there, and now I'm back. I was actually looking at my eBird list from Grand Isle. Still a little echoey. You want to just mess with the volume maybe and turn it down a little? I was at Grand Isle on April 10th of last year, so it's almost like a year in the middle. How are we doing now?
There we go.
Still a little echoey in the background. Maybe just turn the volume down, see if that does anything. How are we sounding now? Is that better? Does that sound better?
Yeah.
A little good?
Yeah.
All right. You can still hear me in the back?
Well, it just cut out.
Okay. Well, I'll just keep going here and we'll keep messing with the sound. So it's like it took a year off in between, and now I'm back in Louisiana and Baton Rouge. I got to go out to the a meat bird sanctuary this morning, and if you haven't been out there yet, I recommend going and walking around. We had some nice birds. And lots of plant life and other bugs we were putting on iNaturalist. They have a whole project going there now. And anyway, it's a great new sanctuary spot with Audubon here. And we had a good walk around there this morning. This, as I mentioned, is called a sword-billed hummingbird. You can see these in South America. And they have the longest, I think, beak-to-body ratio of any bird in the world. They feed on those hanging tubular flowers that you can see in the tropics. But my favorite feature of the sword-billed is actually the color of its feet. If you look closely, the feet of a sword-billed hummingbird are actually bubblegum pink color, which is quite unusual for a hummingbird, and I think very endearing in many ways for those ones. All right. I want to show you some paperwork to get this party started. I don't know if you know what this form is, but when you travel to a foreign country, you know, they always pass this piece of paper out on the plane when you're coming in for a landing, and this is an immigration form. So I've filled quite a few of these out over the years, traveling to different places. This one happens to be from Jamaica, and for some reason, almost all immigration forms have a spot where you're supposed to put your occupation, which I don't really know about each and one of you, but sometimes I have kind of a hard time describing myself and exactly what it is that I do in one concise word. So I've written all kinds of things on these forms over the years. For a long time, I was just putting writer, which I figured was a nice, like, suitably vague, all-encompassing term, and that was until it was April of 2015. I came into the country of Jamaica, and I walked up to the counter, and I gave them my form, and the guy read it, and then he looked me in the eye, and he was like, well, what kind of writer are you? And I was kind of taken aback. I'd never been questioned on this before, so I said, I write books. And he said, what kind of books? And I said, books about birds. And then there was this kind of awkward pause, and you could see him like sizing me up, this like single male, young, very disheveled looking traveler with like no luggage to speak of, coming in to Jamaica saying you write bird books? Yeah, likely story. So he started asking me all these searching questions about who I was and where I was from and what my intentions were for the country of Jamaica that day. And I really wanted to say, look, I am on an around-the-world bird-watching binge trying to become the first human in recorded history to spot 5,000 species of birds on planet Earth in one calendar year. I've got 27 hours to track down all 29 endemic species of birds on this tiny Caribbean island. My friends are waiting outside. Will you please just let me through? Which I did not say. And he did eventually let me pass, but I kind of learned my lesson. So on every immigration form I've ever filled out since that day, I've just written, Birdman. And no one has ever said a word about it. Has anyone seen this movie, The Big Year? Yes, this is my kind of crowd. Well, if you have not experienced this piece of Hollywood history, this was a 2011 flick that came out starring Jack Black, Owen Wilson, and Steve Martin playing bird watchers. This was actually based on a true story of 3 guys who went around North America, just this continent, in 1998, trying to outdo each other by spotting as many birds as they could in one year. But in the birding world, the idea of a big year actually goes back quite a bit further than that, even back to the days of Roger Tory Peterson in the 1950s, did a big road trip all the way across North America with a British friend of his named James Fisher. They later wrote a book about it called Wild America, which again, I totally recommend if you've never read. But it was during that trip, and in a minor footnote in that book, literally in the last chapter, that Mr. Peterson wrote something like, during my travels in 1953, I observed 573 species of birds, period. And he didn't really mean that like throwing a gauntlet or issuing a challenge exactly, but other birders read the book and kind of took it that way and said, well, I can find more birds than that. And so the idea of the big year was born, and the stakes have kind of been escalating in the decades since then. And so today, you've got guys like Olaf here, did a big year of birding very seriously in 2013, again in North America, with some special rules attached. He said he had to find every species of bird that year in the nude. Which he was quite specific about. He said he could not be wearing clothes and then remove them once he had spotted a bird. He actually had to be wearing only his binoculars and his boots when he first saw it for it to count on his list, but he still ended up with like 600 species of birds by the end of that year, which I think is one of the greatest achievements in all of birdwatching history. But kind of shows you where we've come these days with the idea of big years, at least on this like continental scale. However, no one had ever really taken this idea and applied it properly, I thought, to its logical extreme, which I always thought was interesting because if you look at the world from a bird's eye view, they don't need immigration forms and visas and passports and all the rest of it. They don't see our borders on this world at all. And so if you want to do the ultimate big year from a bird's perspective, on some fundamental level, you kind of got to do the whole planet while you're at it. And there was some precedent for this idea. In 2008, a pair of British twitchers, as they call themselves, across the pond, Roos and Allen, did a bunch of birding trips throughout a year, and they ended up spotting 4,341 out of the 10,000 or so birds found in the world. That was good enough for a new record, and I read their travelogue called The Biggest Twitch, which I was quite inspired by, and got to the end, and then I guess kind of like all those people who had read Peterson's book in the 50s just thought, well, I can find more birds than that. You put my mind to it. But for me personally, I think this trip started through a somewhat more circuitous route, and I think it probably really generated in 2011, incidentally, the same year that Big Year movie would come out a few months later. That summer, I went off on a whole different adventure and hiked the entire Pacific Crest Trail, which is a 2,650-mile route that goes from the border of Mexico all the way up through California, Oregon, and Washington to Canada. That's a whole different story, but I will say, when you spend 123 days, walking all day, every day, wandering through the woods, at some point your mind starts to wander as well, and you start thinking of increasingly crazy ideas about what's the next great adventure going to be out there. And so by the time I got to Canada, at the end of that summer, I kind of had this blueprint plan sketched out in the back of my mind, just in case, the opportunity should ever somehow happen to come up to do it. And then, in 2014, I wrote this book called The Thing with Feathers, which is all about bird behavior and how birds kind of act like people in different ways. You don't really expect a book of essays about bird behavior to become anything like a bestseller exactly, although it kind of was. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for a while, and it's been translated into like 12 different languages at this point. And so after that happened, I was like, well, okay. And I sat down and I wrote a proposal that essentially said, for my next book, I want to go around the world for a year and write a story about it. And I sent this idea off to publishers kind of laughing about it. And then Houghton Mifflin Harcourt came back and they said, yep, sounds like a good plan. In fact, we'll give you an advance up front that should be just about enough to cover the cost of the entire trip. Which is when I suddenly went, oh, crap. So, just in terms of strategy from the very beginning, I knew obviously this was going to be a very international trip in scale from the beginning. Although I still wanted to keep it as local in scope as I could, so I made a couple special rules for myself from the beginning. Fully clothed, of course. First of all, every bird I found would have to be seen by me and at least one other person, which incidentally would give me witnesses for all of these sightings along the way, because it's impossible to photograph them all. And all of those other people would have to be locals living in the same country that I was visiting. So no hiring international tour guides to show me around, or like importing my friends and family from back home to keep me company on the road. This was more about seeking out like-minded bird nerds in all of these far-flung places, contacting them ahead of time, saying, hey, I'm doing this big year. Can I come sleep on your couch for a few days? And do you want to hit your local hotspots? So this, for instance, is just a group of some of the birders who took me out for one morning in northern Borneo when I showed up there. You start multiplying this out, and by the end of this year, I had met literally hundreds and hundreds of different birders in all of these different places along the way. I have learned a few lessons about packing light from hiking the PCT, and I applied those to this trip as well. This is pretty much everything I took for the entire year. I got a 40-liter backpack from REI. You can see there, that's small enough to slide under the seat of an airplane. And then I told myself, well, if it doesn't fit, then I guess I don't need it this year. Although I definitely did need, like, you can see a spotting scope and a tripod, my binoculars, a camera, laptop. That took up about 3/4 of my available weight allowance, as it turned out. So I had just enough room around the edges for a few other odds and ends, an extra pair of underwear. And that silk thing is a sleeping bag liner that I could wrap myself up inside and sleep on people's floors when I had to. But other than that, I think it's really true, not just of traveling, but sort of philosophically in general, that the farther you go, the less stuff you end up needing to take with you along the way. Although, one thing I definitely could not pack, unfortunately, was reference books. And for a birder, this was kind of an issue. These are just some of the field guides covering the countries that I was planning to visit during this year. So this was 2015, most of the apps and things hadn't come out yet that were starting to put this into digital form. I ended up going through every single one of these books and either photographing or scanning all of the ID pages and loading them onto my phone and my laptop. So I had this whole library with me in the field, which was really useful, but it was quite a bit of work, as it turned out, to do all of that scanning up front. And then, the fun part. Okay, so you've got 365 days to track down as many birds as possible on Earth. Where do you want to go? I remember as soon as I knew that I was definitely gonna do this, it was August 2014, so it was about 6 months out from when I would start on January 1st. I laid a map out on my living room floor and started just like enthusiastically putting down dots on all of the priority A-list birding destinations I absolutely could not miss first. And after an hour and a half of happy daydreaming, suddenly it came to my senses and realized just to get to those places I'd already marked on my map was going to take me about 10 years at the rate I was planning this out. It turns out 1 year is a remarkably short amount of time to try to cover this much territory. So I had to be pretty strategic about prioritizing the places with the most biodiversity, of course, which tends to be concentrated in the tropics. Although not forgetting about places with lots of endemic species that you can't find anywhere else. So for that reason, some of the islands were pretty important, like Madagascar and Jamaica. And then I approached this as a continuous one-way trip, more or less going west to east, connecting one point to the next, which meant that I would not be going home at all during this year, except for once when I passed through the US about halfway through. And I'd have new territory to look forward to right up until the very last day ahead of me, which I figured would help keep the momentum moving along and help keep me from burning out on the one thing that I love the most in life by doing it to death for an entire year. And so, at the stroke of midnight on the 1st of January, 2015, I found myself floating on an expedition ship off the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula, because I really wanted one of my first birds of the year to be some type of penguin, which I am inordinately fond of for many reasons. And as it turned out, the chinstrap penguin went down at about 2 a.m. that morning as bird number 4. Bird number 1 was this nice Southern Ocean seabird called a Cape petrel, which I figured was a perfect good omen for things to come, and I was off and running. But I feel like, this is kind of how a lot of people see birding, and especially this type of birding, where you go out somewhere and you find an amazing bird, like a chinstrap penguin on a remote beach in Antarctica. And so you get all excited, and you sneak up as close as you can without disturbing it too much, and maybe you snap a photo, maybe not necessarily required, and you drink in the views with your binoculars, and then at some point, you smack a high five with your friend, and you go, yes! And then you turn around, and you go, check! And then all of a sudden, this amazing bird just becomes like one more notch on your list. And I guess by kicking things off in Antarctica, which strategically speaking was probably just about the worst possible place to start out. There's only like 20 species of birds on the entire continent down there. I wanted to make a somewhat subtle statement from the start that yeah, my goal was to get to 5,000 birds by the end of this adventure. That was the motivation. But for me, it wasn't all just about the numbers and the listing and the check marks aspect of it, because I think it's actually pretty obvious. If you just take one step back, that it's not just about the bird, but also about the people there standing next to you, also enjoying this amazing experience. And then if you take one more big step back, it's also about these amazing landscapes and environments and destinations you get to go to when you're looking for the birds that live there. There are some penguins in this picture, by the way, right there, for a sense of scale, of that massive sea ice and the edge of the Weddell Sea off of the shoreline of Antarctica. So, yeah, it was about the birds. It was about the people, the places, the adventures, the foods, the misadventures, just everything that goes into a big trip like this is why I wanted to do it all in the first place. Now, having said that, I did get back after a full week in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean and got to South America, and I think I still needed to find 4,983 more species to make it to my goal, so I had to hit the ground running when I got there and just started working my way north from Argentina to various parts of Chile, various parts of Brazil. By mid-February, I'd made it here to central Peru. This afternoon, Valentine's Day, the 14th of February, I got higher than I've ever been anywhere in my entire life that day. This was at a place called Chicleo Pass, which is at about 16,000 feet above sea level. And given that I'd started this morning in Lima, which is at sea level, I had a pretty killer altitude head when this photo was taken. But it was, I mean, Peru was just a bar none, spectacular, diverse, amazing country. And I plan to spend the next couple of weeks birding all around there with this gentleman, whose name is Gunnar. He's actually originally a Swedish birder who moved to Peru several decades ago just because he wanted to be immersed in the amazing bird life of this tropical country. And as far as I can tell, he's pretty much flourished there ever since. In fact, when I first sent Gunnar an email, just seeing if he might be available for a few days to go birding with me in Peru, he immediately replied with one sentence in all caps that just said, "I am your man," with 10 exclamation points. And when I arrived, I realized he always is wearing this hat, and again in all caps, embroidered across the front. It says, "More birds." So I figured he probably was. We did have some pretty good adventures together, as it turned out. We went to the rainforest in southeast Peru during the height of the rainy season in late February, and it just never quit raining on us the whole time we were down there. I got a pretty good case of chiggers on my feet, which I guess you get these around here sometimes. They were pretty itchy there for a while. This bus hit a tractor in the middle of a highway, and incidentally on the same day I came down with a pretty severe respiratory flu and bacterial lung infection was stuck around for the next couple of weeks, and this bus got stuck on a bridge, and it took them a few hours to figure out how they were going to dig this thing out of my new road so we could get around it. We had a dead battery in a driving rainstorm on the edge of a cliff in the absolute freaking middle of nowhere, and once we finally got that sorted out and a passing car gave us a new battery so we could continue on our way, we had several flat tires, we got stuck in the mud multiple times trying to get up my new road in the wet season and had to be pulled out by passing trucks with this tow rope that they had. There was a landslide and taken out the whole road at one point. People have been sitting here for 3 days trying to cook their dinner on campfires, waiting for the heavy equipment to arrive, and we actually timed it pretty well. We only had to wait for maybe 3 hours here, birding on our way, before this bulldozer showed up and made a little path, and we were able to get through there, only to find that there was another landslide several kilometers farther up the road, and it didn't even matter at that point because there was an agricultural workers' strike in the highlands that shut down the place that we wanted to go to the next day, so it was kind of on to plan X or Y or whatever comes after Z at that point. However, Gunnar and I persevered, and we eventually made it to this patch of elfin cloud forest in central Peru, because there was a bird there called the golden-backed mountain tanager that I really wanted to see. But this is kind of a tricky place to get to. This tanager is only really found practically in the forest within this photo. And even to get to this spot, Gunnar and I had to leave our accommodation at 2 o'clock in the morning, drive his two-wheel drive van up this heinous track to get to the top at dawn, to then be in position to walk into this forest and look for this golden bird that was originally described by LSU scientists in the 1970s and hadn't really been seen by that many people in the years since then. Well, I don't know what the big deal is. 30 minutes after we walked into the woods here, this bird popped up into a tree right in front of us. Bright yellow, black wings, black tail, a little bit of nice blue on the very top of the head if you take a close look. Absolutely, unmistakably, the golden-backed mountain tanager. Kind of nice to get an easy bird for a change in central Peru. So that one went down on the 17th of February as bird number 1,126. So at this point, I was well and truly off and running on my way. So Gunnar and I smacked our high fives, and eventually and immediately just slams on the brakes, and we skid off the highway into a turnout, and he's sitting there just vibrating in the driver's seat. And I knew that expression. I was like, "Oh, Tim, what is it? What rare bird has just been reported somewhere around here on the rare bird alert?" And he was just like, "You are not going to believe this. I'm in shock." And I said, "What?" And he said, "A brown pelican has just been seen on Cayuga Lake." Do you realize how rare? This is the first inland record of a brown pelican ever from this part of the state of New York. We could go find it right now so I can get it for my county list. And I was like, "Okay, Tim, yes, that is very exciting. You realize, though, I just saw like 10,000 brown pelicans last week in California, where they're supposed to be. I don't really need to see this lost one in New York. In fact, I kind of need to find an American black duck this afternoon. And you can see this look of horror crossing his face. Again, I knew the feeling, because when rare bird alerts come in around Oregon, where I live, I'm often the first one out to try to track them down. So we compromised on a detour, and meanwhile, the reports were coming in with literally up to the second updates of speed and direction of this pelican as it was cruising up the lakeshore. So we were able to turn around and then get ourselves ahead of it and park at a certain marina. About a minute and a half, we looked out in the distance and this speck appeared over the horizon, and sure enough, this brown pelican flew right over our heads, and then it continued on over downtown Ithaca, where the reports kept coming in. It's over the farmer's market right now! It's over campus right now! Leave class! Look at the sky! Which I found highly entertaining. We did track down a black duck later that afternoon as well, so everyone was happy in the end. But I think this is a good illustration of how doing a big year on a global scale just like totally flips the strategy over from doing it on any smaller scale. Even if you are crazy enough to do an entire continent, like those guys in that Hollywood movie did, you are still totally reliant on these lost, out-of-range, vagrant birds that blow into your area, and as soon as one individual gets reported, you gotta drop whatever you're doing right now and go see it wherever it is before it can disappear or turn around and fly back over the border, and you can no longer count it. But if you just do the whole world, you don't need to worry about vagrant birds. In fact, you're not really rewarded for seeing them in places where they're not supposed to be, because eventually you'll just go to the place where they normally live and see them there, which I actually found kind of refreshing about this trip, that it was more about seeking out the birds in the places where they really do inhabit, and than it was about this kind of like ambulance-chasing lost stragglers around that birders are often so well known for. My worst delay of the entire year, out of all the places I went that I showed you on that map, was trying to leave New York City, where I got stranded for about 27 hours by the end. Thanks to United/American/Delta Airlines, I was pretty incensed by this, because my next planned layover was supposed to be in Iceland, where I had planned just over one day to pick up all my Arctic birds for the year before continuing on to Europe and beyond. And by the time the new itinerary came down, they had me now landing in Reykjavik at midnight and then taking off again shortly before 6 o'clock a.m. Thanks. There goes all my Arctic birds. But then I kind of calmed down and I realized that it was early June. It doesn't get dark in Iceland in the northern summer. So I called up my local contact, this nice Icelandic birder named Jan, who I'd never met before in my life, just like exchanged a couple of emails beforehand and explained the situation and said, don't worry about it, I'll just like find a taxi or something, drive around for a couple hours and see if I can pull something out before I have to continue on to Oslo. But, you know, just if you wanted to, it might still be fun to kind of like pull an all-nighter of birding. What do you think? And he didn't even hesitate on the phone. He said, yeah, okay, I'll see you there when you land. So, sure enough, I came down, literally under the midnight sun, and within minutes was scoping for Manx shearwaters offshore, and then Jan and I raced around the outskirts of the city together for the next several hours, picking off new birds left and right. I got my Atlantic puffin at this sea cliff at 3 o'clock in the morning. 4 o'clock a.m., there were whooper swans by the side of the road. 5 a.m., black-tailed godwits. I mean, I was racking them up. Here I got 3 new birds at once. Gray-lag goose, my first Arctic tern of the year, and that's a black-headed gull perched up on the rock. Even the common local birds, again, were new for me because I hadn't been to that latitude yet, so I was really doing quite well. We ended up at this lagoon, which was just outside. You can see the presidential palace of Iceland there in the background, as our last stop before I had to go back to the airport. And I turned to Jan while we were standing there and said, I can't thank you enough do you realize we have just seen 54 species of birds between midnight and just after 5 a.m.? I hope you can at least like go home and get some sleep now. And he smiled and he said, yeah, well, kind of. And I said, what do you mean, kind of? And he said, well, I'm not exactly from Reykjavik. I said, what do you mean? Where do you live? And he said, well, I'm actually from up toward northern Iceland, so I had to drive for about 5 hours just to come meet you at the airport at midnight. Now we've been birding for a few hours together. I'm going to drop you off here at the airport, sleep in the parking lot of my truck for about an hour, and then I actually need to get up and drive 5 hours back home because I'm due back at work this morning. This is the kind of generosity that people come up with when you have a passionate project like this, and I just ran into it over and over and over again throughout this year, and it just totally blew me away every time. So, not having slept myself at this point in about 36 straight hours with the various delays involved and everything, I took the short connection from Reykjavik onward to Oslo in central Norway, walked out, and my next contact there, this very nice Norwegian birder named Bjorn, in the Oslo cemetery, actually a pretty good birding spot. It was rather like swapping in fresh horses for the Pony Express or something at this point, because of course Bjorn was very well rested and he was not about to let me miss any birds on his home territory in Norway, which would like reflect poorly on his own bird watching ability. So his plan for the two of us for the next 4 days in central Norway, where it also does not really get that dark in the northern summer, was that we'd drive around together and pick off these awesome birds, like nesting Lapland longspurs up on the mountain slopes just as the snow was melting off in June. And then in Norway, according to law, as I understand, you are actually allowed to camp on private property almost anywhere you want, as long as you're not like in someone's backyard. So when it got dusky, around 11:30 p.m., he just brought along a couple sleeping bags. We'd throw those down on the ground in the woods, catch a couple of hours of rest, and when the sun came back up at 1, 2 a.m., get back up and keep going. And after 4 more days of that, I was about ready to say, I need to go to a country where it gets dark. I'm going to die. This is not sustainable. But it was admittedly rather fun to be camping out in the Norwegian forest like this, partly because when I kicked off this whole adventure, I'd agreed to write a daily blog on the National Audubon Society's website. And when they set up that page, they sent a photographer to my house in Oregon to take a photo that would serve as the illustration for the blog's home landing page. So here's the photo that photographer came up with. I don't know if you can tell, but this photo is pretty much completely faked, okay? So I'm sitting there in a sleeping bag, reading a copy of my own book, spotlighting an owl up here that's actually a plastic owl that's been nailed to the top of that tree. And this was taken in broad daylight to make it look like it was actually happening after dark. And so I've been looking at this totally faked photo on my own blog's homepage every day for this whole year and kind of laughing about it. Until on the 3rd evening in Norway, Bjorn and I were birding on a forest gravel road, and we got to about 11 o'clock and threw down our sleeping bags and crawled in, and just before we passed out unconscious for the evening, we heard in the distance the sound of a tawny owl calling from the trees nearby. So Bjorn pulled his cell phone out and played from it a snippet of a tawny owl's vocalization, which of course the owl thought was another owl, so it flew in and landed in a tree right over our heads, and from his sleeping bag, Bjorn spotlighted the owl sitting on a branch right up there above us. So in the end, the faked blog photo actually ended up coming almost 100% true from Norway. Once again, in Europe, I didn't really spend that long in the temperate parts of the world, so 1 week total between Norway, Turkey, and Spain, before I then dropped down into Africa for the next 2.5 months of the year. And For me, I think that was probably the most like foreign, exotic feeling part of this whole adventure. The landscapes, the people, the cultures, the wildlife changed pretty dramatically. All of a sudden, there's like all these other animals around all the time that are super cool if you've never seen any of this stuff before. We did get sightings of the big cats in several different places, ran into lions, and I got to watch cheetahs hunting out on the Serengeti grasslands, and this is a leopard face-to-face in Kruger National Park in South Africa. Of course, when you're looking for birds, you see everything else that's out there as well. In fact, I started noticing, especially on these safari sections in South and East Africa, that it was often the groups of birders that ended up seeing more of all the other wildlife than the people who went out there only looking for the big obvious stuff from the start, if that makes any kind of logical sense. But I was legitimately looking for birds, so, you know, when the elephant was at the water hole, the African fish eagle was sitting up above its head on a branch, and when the African buffalo came at us, I was pretty happy about the yellow-billed oxpecker clinging to its back. The birds use the other animals as habitat in Africa. This doesn't really happen in other parts of the world. So you got crazy things like jacanas sitting on top of hippos' heads, and you never know what you're going to see. Sometimes they will stop traffic all on their own. This is a southern ground hornbill crossing the street, again in Kruger National Park in South Africa. I started noticing something else on safari, which was that I'd be out in a safari truck with a group of a couple of birders, and we'd be looking for birds. So we'd come across something awesome, like say, a giant kingfisher sitting next to the road. This is the biggest kingfisher in the world. It's like twice as big as our belted kingfisher here in the US. So we'd be stopped and checking it out and snapping photos and drinking in the views and smacking the high fives and, you know, all the routine as you do. And then after about a minute and a half, you would turn around and there'd be like 15 other safari trucks parked bumper to bumper behind you, all of them wanting to know where the lion was that you were so obviously excited about. And after they realize you're just looking at like some bird in a bush out there in the grass, they be these expressions of almost like disappointment and disgust that you've wasted precious seconds of their vacation and they drive off in a big caravan of ducks. And this got to be kind of an issue for us after a while. So we came up with a solution to this, which was that one of the local birders I was traveling with had a hard copy of the field guide to birds of that area with a big illustration, unmistakably, of a bird on the front cover. So whenever anyone parked behind our bumper to check out what we were checking out, we just roll the window down and wave the field guide out the window at them, and they'd see it and realize we were birding, and at that point, generally just leave us alone. We called that maneuver flipping them the bird. But, moving swiftly onward. From Africa, then onward into Asia for the next 3 months, I was rather impressed all over Southeast Asia, not just how many birds there were in many of those countries, but how many birders also. Places like the Philippines and Borneo and India, places where you might not expect a crowd of birders. Really just in the last 10 or 20 years, I think with digital photography and good field guides and the internet, etc., it's really all of a sudden become a very international thing. And so there were these groups of birders. I'd contact one of them and they'd email back. By this time of the year, it was getting to be like October. The word had sort of spread ahead of me and they'd be like, "You're coming here? Oh my gosh." And they'd invite all of their friends to come along for the day as well. And I was being shown around by these posses of birders everywhere that I went, like this visiting celebrity. It was really fun. This group of birders in Taiwan picked me up from the airport, and they had already decided that they were going to take me out to see a celebrity of their own, just outside city limits. So we caravanned out to see this bird, which is called a Siberian crane. This was the first individual Siberian crane ever seen in Taiwan. It shouldn't be there. Siberian cranes nest in Siberia, and then they should winter in central China. So this young one had evidently wandered off course at some point, and then set up shop in this wet field right next to a busy road just outside Taipei city limits, and it was staked out there. So by the time I showed up, they'd set up barriers in multiple languages to keep people out of this field. The crane was just out there walking around as it had done all day, every day for the previous 5 months that it had been there. There were signs, again, in multiple languages about this crane. There were souvenir stands set up on the side of the road selling crane-themed knickknacks, and the sidewalk was just lined with people trying to take a look at what the Taiwanese called in their media the little white crane. At this point, they estimated that approximately 60,000 people had come out just to take a look at this one rather lost individual bird, which was a bit misplaced. I know I talked about vagrants earlier, but this one shouldn't have been in Taiwan. Siberian cranes are actually a critically endangered species. There's only a couple thousand of them left at this point. So then they were starting to talk about, well, what should we do with this crane? Should we leave it alone? It seems to be relatively happy here. Should we try to capture it and return it to its flock somewhere? It didn't end up mattering because about a month after I saw it, that crane, which had just spent 6 months of its young life in this one field in Taiwan, one day woke up energized in the morning and flew out of the field. And then it sort of circled around, and then it came down somewhat disoriented, it seemed like, and took shelter of the following evening inside an urban subway station in Taipei, while it was filmed on live TV and everything. And then the next morning, everyone left it alone, and took off again, and then it flew out to sea this time, much more purposefully, it seemed like, and disappeared over the horizon. And so no one really knows if that crane managed to rejoin its flock out there, or if it's even still bouncing around from one island to the next. The last country on my itinerary this year was going to be Australia, and I came down in December on the East Coast in the city of Cairns, where I met a local birder named Dell, and then a reporter from the Cairns Post newspaper came out with us that morning, because he wanted to write about, the impending end of this big year adventure. So I remember that guy was asking me all these questions that day, like, what bird do you most want to see here in Australia? And I said, well, I'd really love to see a cassowary, but I don't have a good stakeout, none are being seen right now, I guess, so we'll see. And he went, oh, okay, and he wrote that down in his notebook. And the next day, the headline in the newspaper was something like, birdwatcher wants to break record with the cassowary in Cairns. I was like, well, kind of. I've already broken the record a couple months ago in India, but I would like to see one. And then a couple of hours after the paper came out that day, I got a phone call, because my number was also in this article. I came on the line, and he said, hey, I saw the paper this morning. Have you seen one of them cassowaries yet? And I said, well, no, actually, I don't have a good spot. Do you know where I might be able to find one? And he said, well, yeah, I've got a Cass and a couple chicks. Likes to hang out around my backyard. You can come over, I guess. I was like, hold it right there. I am on my way. And Dell and I drove up to what turned out to be this beautiful property in the wet tropical forest overlooking the city, where this very nice gentleman met me and then took me around back on his property, where, lo and behold, there's this bird that looks like a dinosaur. Technically all birds are the last living lineage of dinosaurs that never quite died out and just kept on evolving, but this one really looks like it, with that crazy helmet thing on top of its head and these deep wattles of skin hanging down with the blue skin on its neck. These things are 5.5 to 6 feet tall, one of the heaviest birds in the world. They have a somewhat dubious reputation of being the world's most dangerous bird, because they do have this sharpened central toenail, and if they kick you hard enough in the stomach, they can actually disembowel you on the spot. That's happened a couple times in the past, but this one seems super friendly, so I didn't see a big deal with hanging out with this father, definitely the male cassowary that always takes care of their chicks, which is one of the most amazing encounters I've had with any bird anywhere, thanks to this very nice guy who just read about me in the newspaper that morning and called me up. Least Christmassy Christmas I've ever spent anywhere in my entire life. I don't know how you'll do it birds down under. This was like 95 degrees Fahrenheit on the 25th of December, a couple hundred kilometers inland from Perth in southwest Australia. This was the only Christmas tree I saw all day on the 25th of December. In fact, I didn't see another human being all day long, except for a very nice birder named Frank from Perth, who had volunteered to spend his whole holiday with me birding in the middle of nowhere, which I was very grateful for. But, you know, if you're in the right festive mood and frame of mind, then any tree could theoretically be a Christmas tree on the 25th of December. So I was pretty happy to see this one that had a vaguely green and red and purple bird in it to celebrate the holiday. This one is called a red-capped parrot. And on the 25th of December, this particular red-capped parrot was bird number 5,959. So at this point, I had well and truly blasted past the initial world record of 4,300. I had superseded my own initial goal of 5,000 in the Philippines and then kept right on going. So it was all kind of gravy by the end. But it would be rather criminal to come so close to 6,000 birds and not quite get there. So I had a dilemma. We went back to Frank's house that evening for Christmas dinner, where he cooked us up some Cornish game hens. I do appreciate birds in many different ways. And we sat there and we painstakingly made a list of every single bird anywhere in Australia that I had not yet seen, and eventually decided that it was just not possible to find 41 more species in the next few days I had before New Year. Maybe if I had a couple weeks, but the distances in Australia are just too big to be able to zip around and pick them off one by one. So then I said, well, Frank, it has been wonderful birding with you here, but where in the world could I go maybe to get 41 more birds? I've only got one shot at this. Fortunately, that same year, 2015, eBird had just come out with a brand new feature called Target Species, which will filter all of the sightings for any given geographic region against your own personal list and tell you the ones that you haven't seen in descending order of frequency of encounters in the field. So it will give you a target list for anywhere that you could care to visit. And I ran that for a bunch of different places on Christmas evening and eventually decided that the one country I could actually kind of go back to, because I'd already been to once in September, was India. But this time, way up in the northeast corner in the province of Assam, there were a bunch of bird species in that region that I just hadn't got to from any other angle. So some kind of fancy footwork with booking plane tickets and visas and everything at a moment's notice on a holiday. 24 hours after spending this blistering Christmas in the Australian outback, I came down in the Himalayan foothills of northeast India, where it was freezing cold. It was like getting dark at 3 o'clock in the afternoon with the wacky time zones they have in that part of the world. And I met up with these young, gung-ho, hardcore Indian birders, and they were just totally dedicated to going hard for the last couple days we had left and trying to get 41 more species to make it. We ended up finding this bird. There's a bird in this photo, I swear. This is a terrible photo of a really good bird called a yellow-rumped honey guide that's only really found in a narrow elevational range, almost always next to vertical rock faces like you can see here that also have an active honeybee hive attached, so kind of specific habitat, hence the name of the bird. But when we saw this honey guide, I was just like jumping up and down in this freezing cold, dusty Indian Himalayan road, because on the 29th of December, this one was bird number 6,000. Of course, I still had 2 more days, so the very last bird I saw was about 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve. We found this nice little owl called an oriental bay owl, and I snapped this photo, and Ramit, who I just showed you a picture of, was standing next to me, and he turned around with a big smile, and he said, "Do you realize how rare this owl is here?" And I said, "Well, no, I wasn't really expecting to see one in India, but how rare is it?" And he said, "Well, as far as I know, This is the first photograph ever taken of a wild oriental bay owl anywhere in the entire country of India. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's it. The big year is officially a wrap. So by the time the dust settled, I had transited through 41 countries on all 7 continents. If you add up all these hops from one dot to the next, that represents almost exactly 100,000 miles by air, which might sound like a lot. That's maybe like 4 round trips to Australia from here. It may seem sort of counterintuitive, but I hardly spent any of this year in and around airports, because each of these haps was like an hour or 2 at the most to get to the next place. I booked those transfers largely after dark in the evening, so I could preserve my daylight hours, and then I'd spend a couple days at the next place. So I never had like jet lag or any of that kind of stuff that you would normally associate with a long-haul international birding trip, because I was just gradually working my way from one place to the next as I went. I think in the end, I end up spending almost exactly 60,000 US dollars on the whole trip, all expenses included, all of the travel, accommodation, food, gear, local guides in different places, etc. Again, I just throw that out there. Maybe that sounds like a lot. Maybe that sounds like not so much. To me, $10 per bird seemed like a pretty small price to pay. And I think it goes to show that travel, like many other things, is a priority. Would you rather have a nice shiny new SUV in your garage at home? Or would you rather go to every single place that's shown on this map? These are literally the choices that we're all making from one day to the next. Even maybe it's more subconsciously than consciously from one day to the next. By the end of this adventure, I was pretty much a bird-watching machine. I could reel off at the top of my head the names and field marks of every bird I'd seen and where I'd seen it, and a whole year of doing nothing else all day, every day. But now, to be honest, several years have passed. Some of the more obscure birds I saw in places I wasn't so familiar with, like parts of Africa, have just started to evaporate. It is hard to keep the names of all those species straight, all the Comeropteras and Aeromomalas and Zynixisticolas and Oleandrinus hemispinguses, etc. straight. But I do now, even today, still remember pretty much every single one of the birders that I met along the way during this journey. And I think these are the memories that stick with you the most when you travel on any kind of adventure, but especially when you have this intense shared interest with every person that you're meeting along the way. Of course, the great thing about birds is it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from. Birds are found everywhere in the world, and so anyone can become fascinated by them. And so I think it's kind of poignant that something like a shared love of birds can help connect us together in ways that if you watch the international news these days, it seems like very few other things can anymore. So I think that's pretty cool. And after all is said and done, if I can help redirect some of that type of energy now back out into the universe, then I will consider that more than anything else accomplished.